Joe Buccino, who's the former communications director of US Central Command, CentCom, which directs and commands American military operations in the Middle East, Central and South Asia. He's retired US Army colonel and the author of When Every Word Counts, How to Earn Trust, Command Attention, Communicate Clearly in Any Situation. Welcome to France 24, Colonel. Let's begin with your assessment of what's going on in this de facto blockade in the Arabian Sea, the Strait of Hormuz. Give us an idea of US naval assets as well and operations. Are there 2, 3 aircraft carriers now? What's going on?
Well, there's about to be 3 carrier strike groups in the region. So we're going to have, more than a grand total of 30 ships. This is more naval firepower than we've had in the region since we started the Iraq War in 2003. It's, really a time when we've been trying for years now to move naval assets out of Central Command and into the Indo-Pacific. And now, of course, the Middle East seems to always suck us back in terms of resources, manpower, ships, soldiers. And so we see that happening here again.
I want to get onto this. You raise a very good issue. I think there's a number of reports this week about attrition, certainly concerns about ammunition, concerns about depletion of munitions as well. But on the seizures earlier this week, do you know what happened when people see there's been a seizure and there's a hole blown in the middle of the engine of the vessel? Where is it now? What happens after that process?
The ship then is escorted to land to the closest naval port. And then from there, everything is offloaded there that needs to be confiscated. The ship is searched for any missiles, any mines, anything that could pose a risk to our assets or to any of the commercial vessels that need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz once we open the Strait of Hormuz. And then from there, basically everything's offloaded, put into a Navy ship, and then eventually brought into one of the carrier strike groups.
The 2 vessels as well that they're on took, is there intelligence on what happens to the crew, where they're taken to after being boarded by Iranian apparent special forces ops?
The intelligence is not clear. There's coastal batteries and there's coastal ramps along the Strait of Hormuz, so they're offloaded there. Certainly everything that Iran would want to confiscate is confiscated from there. And then what happens to the crews and what happens to the rest of the material is a little bit unknown. Certainly, we've got satellites operating in the area that would identify where the ships go from there, but the ships haven't moved. The ships have been moved to the coast, the Iranian coast and the Strait of Hormuz. And then from there, what the next steps are unknown.
One thing I'd like your take on, Colonel, is what happens if boarding, it's clearly a febrile situation. If there is resistance, I understand that there's kind of 2 types of resistance you could see with vessels if they refuse US orders. We heard from Pete Hegseth this week, today in fact, saying there's been something like 34 vessels forced to turn round. But you can obstruct, and I think you can have a contested boarding as well. Your own personal point of view on kind of where things sit right now. We can easily talk about a stalemate and an easy kind of truce, but I would imagine it's very, very quickly things could go wrong.
Look, there's tensions all around this thing. There's the potential for miscalculation, for miscommunication. There's potential for escalation all around this thing. Our troops, our Navy troops, and the Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is largely the folks, the soldiers and the folks that would do the boarding and that would adjudicate anything with those ships if they don't comply with the orders to turn around. They're well trained in this. We have a lot of confidence in our Marines that would do this. We have a lot of confidence in our Navy commanders, certainly in the CentCom commander, Admiral Bradley Cooper. And they're well trained for this. But this is a very pressurized situation. There's tensions all around this thing. And I'd just be concerned if this thing goes into June, July, even August, the risk of miscalculation, the risk of a miscommunication here could really escalate this into a flashpoint that we didn't really want.
In crude military terms, there's been a combined 24,000 bombs dropped between the US and Israel and Iran. The regime's still fighting back. and escalates when the US escalates, it seems. Roughly 55,000 US troops estimated to be deployed in the region, stockpiles being depleted. We've seen the New York Times article today, and the Atlantic Council also talking about this sustained conflict consumption rate, where analysts warn the entire US interceptor stockpile could be exhausted in something like in 4 to 5 weeks, which creates vulnerabilities for NATO, Ukraine, Taiwan, Japan. Is this perhaps a key factor of why President Trump hasn't restarted the bombing campaign? What's your take?
Well, I don't know if it's a factor why we haven't restarted the bombing, but it is a real issue here in D.C. The interceptor issue, the SM-1 and the SM-3, which are really high-tech, cutting-edge interceptors, that's been a problem. That's been a shortage before all this started. That was a problem a year and a half ago in Ukraine, when we were just pushing these interceptors into Ukraine. And now it becomes a problem here. It becomes exacerbated because you're taking interceptors out of Ukraine into the Middle East. And once again, you're taking assets back into the Middle East in terms of this flashpoint. We don't really have the defense industrial base to just crank out interceptors very quickly and to just churn these things out like we did, if you think about World War II, when the entire country was cranking out, pieces for the war machine. So beyond, the next couple of months, this is really going to be a problem with the interceptors.
When we listen to Peter Hegseth today talking about not needing Europe, but they would perhaps need to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, do you think the Strait of Hormuz can be secured militarily by the US alone, or with allies to allow safe passage? Or, in your view, is that impossible without Iran's say-so?
I think the Strait of Hormuz can be secured strictly with the 3 carrier strike groups. Where you'd need NATO, where you'd need allies, is in escorting ships, escorting these commercial vessels out of the Strait of Hormuz, which is going to be necessary. The commercial vessels are not going to transport on their own, particularly with the risk of mines. We don't know where all the drifting mines are. That's the real problem, is the drifting mines, because sonar does not pick them up. They don't emit a signature. They look like trash and debris and wood. And so that's going to be the real risk. It's psychological for the cargo ships. They're not going to assume risk. Each one of those cargo ships needs an escort on the front and on the back, and we just don't have the naval ships to block the Strait of Hormuz, to continue our blockade and to escort those ships out. That's where you need NATO.
We've described the depletion of to the US munitions, key parts of its weaponry as well. Iran, with that blockade clearly being strangled to a point we don't know at the moment. It's kind of like a blink contest. What do you think could break the stalemate?
I think there's pressure on both sides. I'm not sure how much the Trump administration and the people in the White House are feeling the pressure here in this country. I know in this country, people in the United States and across, the broader United States. So when you get outside of D.C. and they're in, real America, Midwest, the Northeast, people are talking about gas prices. People are talking about the cost that this is imposing, on their lives. How much Trump is feeling that, how much he cares about the midterms, you probably need a political expert to figure that out. He's not running for re-election. So, it's unknown how much he's feeling the pressure. I know that in Iran, the pressure is that the Strait of Hormuz and the Karg Island, it funds the war machine. So once they get to a point where they cannot pay the IRGC, there's a risk that the IRGC is just going to lay down their weapons and blend into the countryside. Okay, that becomes a real problem for Iran in terms of its fighting force. And so that could be the breaking point for Iran.
A brief last thought from you. The Pentagon announcing earlier this week that the Navy's top civilian official, John Phelan, the Secretary of the Navy, is leaving. He's one of dozens of senior military leaders to leave or be asked to resign since the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth came to office. You must still speak to those inside the military. Do you sense any concern about the leadership of the force under Pete Hegseth? What's your take?
Well, I do. I mean, it's more felt in the Army. There's been a lot of Army generals that have been churned out. It's look, the Secretary of Defense gets to have the leadership he wants, civilian leadership, the military leadership that he wants. And in this case, the situation with John Phelan at the Secretary of the Navy had nothing to do with this situation in Iran. It was tied to, there's been a shipbuilding effort, get new ships into the force, and perhaps that was moving too slowly for the administration. Be that as it may, these things are political decisions at the top of the Department of Defense. These people are politicians, even the military officers, they're part politicians. And the Secretary of Defense gets to identify the leadership he wants. Pete Hegseth is trying to change the culture of the U.S. military to be a warfighting culture. And, that's the way he's maneuvering this. A lot of these decisions that I'm seeing with the flag officers are politically based and personality based. And that's just the nature of DC.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you, Colonel. Thank you for your time, Joe. Joe Buccino, former Communications Director of CentCom, Central Command, and retired US Army Colonel. Thank you.